Max, how are you?
Good to see you, Mario.
What a way to start the year. We were talking about Venezuela not long ago, and it's a country you know very well. You've spent a lot of time there. You know the history of the country very well, and you've also studied the history of regime changes, U.S.-led regime changes in Latin America very well. I would love to get before I get your initial reaction to the facts we know today. What was your initial reaction when you first got the news? A lot of people were worried that was the beginning of a full amphibious assault on the country, the beginning of a new war with troops on the ground. Did you have those initial concerns when the reports came out? And did it take you a while to believe those reports? To Is that something that surprised you, or you kind of expected?
I I'd gotten to bed pretty late, so I actually wound up watching. I mean, there was no way to watch it live, but I was up late enough to be awake when the U.S. invasion of Caracas began. So I was shocked by the sheer gangsterism of what took place. I, at the same time, began to entertain theories when I saw that Nicolas Maduro had been kidnapped, not arrested or captured, but kidnapped, and was flown out of the country, about how this could have taken place with so little resistance. I was one of the first people in US media to speculate that Donald Trump and Marco Rubio specifically had wanted some kind of deal for a negotiated exit of Nicolas Maduro that would actually leave the PSUV, that being the party of Maduro and previously Hugo Chavez, the PSUV structure in place, meaning that he would work within the Chavista realm to install a figure like Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, and then try to work with her and whittle down what was left of Chavismo in the country in order to exploit Venezuelan resources and finagle various contracts for Trump's cronies. And I said that on our live stream based on sources that I had who had actually been close to the negotiations, multiple sources. And I got that right. And now the New York Times has an article with that essentially as the headline. And you can see people in the Venezuelan opposition who are close to Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace. I mean, I have trouble even saying that she won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was basically the Nobel War Prize. But she was the face and voice of the Venezuelan opposition who was supposed to be installed in place of Maduro. I was not surprised when Trump came out that day and declared that Maria Corina Machado had not enough support in Venezuela to actually rule, and that she wasn't going to be coming back. That was something that I predicted on our live stream, our last live stream of 2025, just based on sources, but also based on my own reading of Donald Trump's behavior, his condemnation of her getting the Nobel Prize, the way they were talking about her in the media, his disregard for her predecessor, Juan Guaido. So that wasn't surprising to me. And so then we have this theory of some kind of deal and questions to ask about whether the Venezuelan military stood down. Obviously, the US military is a dominant force. No country can resist it. But if one helicopter had been taken down, Black Hawk Down style, it would have been a political catastrophe for Donald Trump. And we saw that happen actually in Israel's second invasion of Lebanon in 2006. A transport helicopter was taken down with a Kornet missile, Russian Kornet missile, which actually is mainly for like anti-tank, anti-personnel. And it was a political disaster for Israel's leadership, Ehud Olmert, and basically ended their invasion. So this would have been a catastrophe for Trump. Venezuela's forces, they didn't need a Buk or Panzer anti-aircraft system to hit the Chinook helicopters. And I'm not trying to be some military nerd here. It just kind of stands to reason. They were given hundreds of Russian manpads it was announced in a press release by Venezuela's defense minister, Padrino Lopez, but you didn't see any of that. The casualties now that we know took place, many civilians, which is horrible, which is a war crime, and 16, I'm seeing reports that 16 guards of Nicolas Maduro were killed, essentially massacred, including his personal bodyguard, who had previously guarded Hugo Chavez, his predecessor. So this raises questions about whether they were left out there on their own, and that much of this was choreographed. There are also questions to ask about what China knew and when it knew it, given that Xi had envoys meeting with Nicolas Maduro 6 hours before this operation took place at Miraflores Palace, and what was worked out there. So these are the surprising elements, along with the violence of it. I think a deal could have been worked out through Maduro, which means that Trump, there's another theory to entertain, which is that Trump wanted to climb down and he needed to extract some kind of PR victory and have some Rambo-style reenactment of the Panama invasion, in which the U.S. abducted Manuel Noriega on the same day that it abducted Nicolas Maduro, January 3rd. But these are all, I think, plausible theories within some kind of within some kind of factual ballpark. But we haven't been able to determine what the truth was about any deal. And even if there was a deal, I think things could still go south pretty quickly for the U.S. plan.
Let's talk about the first theory, and one I've discussed with other guests, of a potential stand-down order. So we do know, the might of the American military. And there's been reports that the air defense systems were intercepted, the communication systems were disrupted. And there's been precision strikes on the Russian air defense systems, the S-300s and the BUKs. And there were also anti-radiation missiles as well that were used, plus the electricity, potentially through a cyber attack, was shut down in the region. Why would you say, though, there's a stand-down order? I think you've explained because there's been no strikes on any helicopter. And if so, who would have given that stand-down order? Who has that capacity? And when I mentioned that to other guests, one of the guests, Ian Bremer, he said that he finds that possible but unlikely because it would backfire on whoever gave that order. It's a very unpopular order to ask your military to stand down when an aggressor is attacking your country and kidnapping or capturing your president.
Well, I mean, he's just speculating, and I'd be doing the same. There are so many possible theories that by not aggressively resisting a U.S. invasion, which was essentially a decapitation attempt to remove but not necessarily assassinate Nicolas Maduro and his wife, that you're sparing the country from more horrific U.S. violence, the kind that we saw Baghdad experience during shock and awe and beyond. I mean, the U.S. destroyed half of Raqqa during Operation Inherent Resolve, I think it was called, and this is called Operation Absolute Resolve. I mean, they're invoking all of these past horrific operations. Delcy Rodriguez is the vice president, and I'm not in any way speculating that she gave a stand-down order, but she has her own. I interviewed her in her office in 2021, and at the end of our interview, we talked about her father, Jorge Antonio Rodriguez, who was a revolutionary militant in the 1970s under the US-backed Fourth Republic, who was tortured to death in prison as a fairly young man. She grew up without a father, and that lingers for her. That the notion that she could be assassinated is very real. She understands the threat of violence from the US and its local proxies, who are represented in today's opposition, which is a deeply undemocratic opposition. So she may have taken measures to protect herself and her country from further violence. These are, again, all theories. I don't know who could have issued the stand down order. Marco Rubio is asked in a pretty, let's say, flawed interview with Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation about why the U.S. didn't take out Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, or take out Diosdado Cabello, who represents another power center, which is centered heavily in the military and the militant forces that would defend the government in the street. And Rubio said, you can't just go in and take out 5 people at once. It was hard enough to take out, to kidnap one, or he didn't say kidnap, but to capture one. And I don't totally accept that explanation, although it would have raised the stakes and the risk factor for U.S. troops. But you have to consider that if you start to collapse every power center within the Chavista political apparatus, that you have a complete power vacuum that can't be filled with anything, and it destabilizes the entire country. Diosdado Cabello, again, he's one of the most important figures within the pantheon of the PSUV, and he was out on the street after Maduro's abduction with military figures behind him declaring resistance to this invasion and wearing on his vest, I think, an increasingly important symbol, which is the flag of the Second Republic of Venezuela, essentially the flag of Simón Bolívar, who ousted the Spanish colonists from South America and forged a vision of Gran Colombia, regional integration against imperial control. And so Diosdado Cabello is signaling something there. And so again, I don't think this is over. There may have been a deal, but Delcy Rodriguez on her own, she doesn't have the guns behind her. Someone like Diosdado, Padrino Lopez, they do. You see the radical Venezuelan opposition calling for them to be taken out next, but that would leave a massive power vacuum, and it would quickly become a catastrophe for Marco Rubio, especially, who sees himself as the sort of viceroy of Venezuela.
How much support does Delcy, the former vice president, now the interim president, how much support does she have in Venezuela? And secondary is, would love to get your thoughts on the theory that she might have been the person in Maduro's inner circle that was giving the CIA and the U.S. intelligence information on his whereabouts, and potentially, as you said, might have, you didn't say that, but some are saying she might have been even the person that played a role in the alleged or potential stand down order that was given. So essentially, could she have been the U.S. mole?
Okay, I didn't say that or speculate.
You didn't, no.
That, just to be clear, and I think we have to have, she has to be asked those questions by interviewers. I interviewed her, just to go to your first question, in 2021. So it was the midst of COVID, the COVID event, and she had taken control of administering the Venezuelan state response to COVID, which enabled her to be on TV every day addressing the nation, in the same way that maybe Andrew Cuomo addressed New Yorkers, or Anthony Fauci. And in some ways she superseded Maduro because she was responding to the crisis every day with directions. She was the vice president, but she'd also taken control of other ministries and was presiding over Venezuela's economic revival after years and years of sanctions, to the great chagrin of the U.S. And this is something that was acknowledged in the New York Times today in a profile of Delcy. She stabilized the economy, and the economy has been growing at a fairly rapid rate over the past 4 years. I think they might have reached 8% growth last year, which is something that the United States didn't want to see.
Can you elaborate on this? Because obviously one thing we both agree on is that we both don't think regime changes are a good idea. Historically, they really haven't worked. But I think one area we differ on is the state of Venezuela under Maduro and even Chavez. And I looked at the statistics, the economy, and please do disagree with me with this as well if you feel free to do so. But from the statistics that I have, according to various sources, the economy shrunk by 80% between 2013 and 2022. Living standards by about 74%. Oil production dropped by about 80% since the peak in the 1990s. It's about a fifth now. 95% of the population lives in poverty, massive inequality, and a big chunk of the population left the country since Maduro took over. And now, post 2024 elections, 43%, according to a few polls, considered leaving due to repression. Now, the reason this is the case, the situations like this, some people blame US sanctions, others blame the mismanagement by Maduro. First, do you agree that the economy is doing that badly? A second, what do you blame for that? And third, could that change under the vice president or someone else taking the leadership, taking Maduro's position?
Well, some of the statistics you cited were flawed, but I agree generally with what you're saying about just from a statistical point of view. Delcy Rodriguez had as I was saying, had presided over an economic revival in Venezuela, which threatened U.S. hegemony, and China was central to this economic revival. If you look at another statistic, I think it would be helpful. Exports of barrels of oil of Venezuelan barrels of oil per day. And it was going up from a low point, and I'll get into the question of why. It was going up from a low point of like 400,000 to over 1 million, thanks to China, which was becoming the main export center for Venezuela, which is why Trump imposed a quarantine. And China was buying like 75% of Venezuela's oil, which was leading to growth. Venezuela was able to begin to repair its aging and broken oil infrastructure with the help of China, Russia, and also Iran was providing them with a lot of help, which is why you hear this hysteria about Iran forming this base on the American continent, on the South American continent through Venezuela. It was because Venezuela had normal relations with Iran and treated it like a normal country instead of a terrorist country. Now, going back to the statistics you cited, 2012 was a pivotal year. It's when Secretary of State John Kerry cut a deal with Saudi Arabia to go back and check out headlines around this time, cut a deal with Saudi Arabia's royal family to increase oil production at Aramco massively in order to flood the market, which would thereby weaken Venezuela's main source, its main economic engine. And in exchange, Kerry promised support for the so-called moderate rebels in Syria to the Saudi royal family, and to basically allow Prince Bandar to set up all these proxies like Jaish al-Islam. It was a really dirty deal. It harmed Venezuela. And around this same time, Hugo Chavez died under circumstances some consider suspicious. Nicolas Maduro came in within 1 month, after an election held in 1 month, and he was the legitimate, uncontested winner of that election. And Venezuela then experienced 2 years of riots, just 2 years straight of Guarimba riots, overseen by US-trained, US-funded renter riots and their leadership, who were completely funded by USAID and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. We're talking about Leopoldo Lopez, Juan Guaido, these characters, Carlos Vecchio. This set back Venezuela's economy massively, and then Obama began to sanction Venezuela's oil sector and individually sanction Venezuelan business leaders and Venezuelan political leaders in 2015, leading us to 2017 with Trump coming in and enacting a campaign of maximum pressure, similar to what he did to Iran. Then you have the regime change attempts under Juan Guaido, when Venezuela's largest foreign asset in Citgo was literally stolen by the US regime, which also presided over the theft of $20 billion in gold reserves held in the Bank of England. They just took the gold. So Venezuela is just being subjected to international piracy by the most powerful empire in human history. Naturally, its economy is going to experience a massive decline. And now you see these comments from groups of Venezuelans in South Florida, the base of the regime change lobby, who are saying, we're so happy, we're going to go back maybe because Venezuela's free, but we're not so sure, because the U.S. hasn't relieved Venezuela of the economic quarantine, the economic blockade, because Marco Rubio wants to exploit it in order to destroy Cuba as well. But the last waves of Venezuelan migration to the U.S. and the poverty of Venezuela has been directly caused by the unilateral sanctions, or what we could call financial terrorism, imposed on Venezuela by the U.S. regime, which is doing the same thing to Iran, which caused legitimate protests in Iran's bazaars over inflation directly caused by sanctions. And they're using those protests as a vehicle for more renter riots, which U.S. and Israeli leadership has not even attempted to conceal, in which U.S. and Israeli leadership has not attempted to conceal their exploitation and desire from Mossad to increase the violence. So that's what Venezuela has been facing. And I don't think there's any way of denying that the U.S. played a role, or that Venezuela was beginning to slowly extricate itself from the financial terrorism, which posed a real threat to U.S. empire. What is at the base of U.S. empire? What is the underpinning, the bedrock of it? It is the dominance of the dollar. And once a country manages to get out of sanctions, the dollar begins to decline.
How much blame do you put on Maduro himself and his lack of qualifications as a former bus driver appointed by Hugo Chavez? Do you think he is he's capable of taking Venezuela back to its former glory, the pre-Hugo Chavez glory, as one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America? Or do you think if his political party remains in power, the Chavismo movement remains in power, could a different leader within that movement do a better job in rebuilding not only the economy, but the entire institutional system that allows the country to function, but also cooperate with the U.S. As other Latin American countries have done? Could that be an outcome? Because we're not seeing a regime change here. As you said, you were very critical in our last interview that Maria Machado should not, or the gentleman she's supporting, I've got his name, should not be the leader of Venezuela if Maduro's replaced. And that's the case. That seems to be happening. Trump distanced himself from her. So if this is not a regime change, if the regime's still in power, could a different leader within that regime do a better job than Maduro?
Well, it was never a question of qualifications. And now there's this very specious story being introduced that Trump really decided to invade Caracas and abduct Maduro because he didn't like Maduro's dancing. That's the same Donald Trump who does the Trump dance every time he hears YMCA, and it became a national sensation. I don't know, maybe he didn't want Maduro to one-up him because he was like a slightly better dancer, was doing some salsa moves, but it was never a question of competence. There has been corruption under the Bolivarian Republic launched by Hugo Chavez because Venezuela is a petrostate. You've had corrupt figures within the realm of Chavez and PDVSA, the state oil company, who stole billions of dollars. And when the Venezuelan state attempted to prosecute them, they fled to Florida and found protection from the U.S. in exchange for, squealing on Maduro. Prior to that, Venezuela was extremely corrupt, and it was under IMF management, and you had bread riots in the street. Maduro, it was the foreign minister under Hugo Chavez. He's someone that I've interviewed and I've engaged with on several occasions, who considers himself a student of Simón Bolívar, who's very well read, who is watch his speeches, his press conferences, including engaging with the international media, and I've been to several of them, and he speaks in an articulate way, blending history, politics, and his own kind of sense of humor and sardonic wit for 2 hours at a time, 3 hours at a time. He was not a stupid guy. They call him a bus driver. He was the leader of the bus drivers union, who comes from a working class barrio in Caracas and organized masses of people who became an important power base for PSUV, which led him into Hugo Chavez's administration. Hugo Chavez before him had 2 master's degrees, was born in extreme poverty in the Venezuelan Llano, the plains, and worked himself up through the Venezuelan military and gathered his own credibility through the ranks of the military. So the idea that these are just dumb guys leading their nation to ruin is ridiculous, especially when you look at the figure of Donald Trump, someone who dodged the draft in Vietnam, was born with a silver foot in his mouth, can barely make it through press conferences without blurting out impolitic comments, and is increasingly incoherent while Americans are facing an unprecedented debt crisis. I don't even personally blame Trump for the economic crisis. I blame the economic system that we're in, which is something Venezuela has been prisoner to. So the question is, can Delcy Rodriguez, through her sheer brilliance, get Venezuela out of this and unite one of the most polarized countries on the planet? Well, she's a very smart woman herself, whether you disagree with her or not. She's clever. She's very good at working with the media, but that's just not going to be enough, because Venezuela is, like every other country in the Western Hemisphere right now, and territory, including Greenland, in the crosshairs of the most powerful empire in human history. And so the message that the Trump administration and Trump world, this kind of business mob that Trump runs, is sending is, if you want to actually have a sovereign country within our realm, and you actually want to offer an economic alternative to our system of neoliberal capitalism, you have to have the guns to resist us, or we will crush you. And that's really what's going to decide this at the end of the day, not one singular personality and their sheer brilliance.
So I understand you're critical of the intervention that we're seeing in Venezuela and just foreign intervention in general by the US. What do you think they did right? Obviously, militarily, it was a success. Would you give them credit for not considering, because I know you were critical, as I said earlier, of Maria Machado, not considering having Maria Machado come in and take power and trying to work with the existing regime? Also, what do you make of the threats that came in? Not sure if you saw the updates just before we did our interview, the threats on the former Vice President Rodriguez about Trump. I think Trump said that if she doesn't do what the US wants, something worse than Maduro could happen to her, which is indicating that maybe what could be worse than being arrested and taken to jail, maybe assassinated. What do you make of these threats and the way they're approaching this?
To the first question, what has been done right by Rubio is that Venezuela has not been destabilized. That would have been...
That was a big concern of yours when we spoke, yeah.
And it still could be. Iran was not destabilized by the U.S. attack, which appeared to be, I wouldn't say symbolic, but it was a means to close out the conflict and actually salvage Israel, which was suffering more than I think the U.S. expected under Iranian ballistic missile attacks. So they've closed one chapter, and Venezuela's streets remain pretty calm at this point. Speaking to a friend who's there now a few hours ago, there's a lot of panic buying, but that's it for now. So they've managed to avoid that for now, but Donald Trump, as he said, is threatening Delcy Rodriguez essentially with her life. I mean, that's the message they're sending, is we are just this global mafia and we'll take you out. We will just take you out if you defy us. Trump, in his press conference announcing the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, declared that Delcy Rodriguez will do whatever we want. That was wishful thinking. And what do they want? Trump has made a lot of promises to business cronies that they will be able to profit from Venezuela's wealth. And they've supported Donald Trump as a result. I was just looking at photos from a recent event held by the right-wing outlet Breitbart in Washington. And J.D. Vance was the keynote speaker. And then he was mingling afterwards with figures from a group called Tower Strategies, which is headed by the former CIA station chief or one of their consultants is the former CIA station chief in Venezuela. And they're basically trying to recruit as clients U.S. corporations that want to plunder Venezuela. And J.D. Vance was right there mingling with them. You have, I question why Elon Musk got so interested in Venezuela when Maria Corina Machado and then Edmundo Gonzalez were running for election in 2024. But I know that he is interested in access to lithium and minerals and has said in response to a Twitter commenter, we'll coup whoever we want in Bolivia, which has the world's largest lithium reserves. And now he's pumping up what just took place and algorithmically juicing every tweet, including fake AI videos of people celebrating what took place in Venezuela. So Trump owes a lot to his donors. He has a lot to gain personally through his family and the various business entities they've set up, like World Liberty Financial through his sons and Steve Witkoff's sons. Venezuela also has crude oil, which the U.S. needs, and from a strategic point of view. And I think Delcy Rodriguez was right to say this when she responded to the abduction of Maduro, that this assault on Venezuela has Zionist characteristics. Now you see major Zionist billionaires like Bill Ackman or Netanyahu himself or former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett declaring that this was a giant victory and that it means Iran is next. If the U.S. can somehow, some way take control of Venezuela's crude oil and begin refining it again in Louisiana and Texas, then it will weaken Iran. I mean, this is how the theory goes. I'm not speaking for myself. It will weaken Iran's ability to close off the Strait of Hormuz because the U.S. will not be as dependent on oil delivered through that shipping lane. So I can see so many reasons why Trump is interested here. But the first one goes to the heart of his administration and why what he wants to do, which is to make lots of money.
Another theory is it gives a lot more control for the US of the global oil market. China is the biggest exporter of Venezuelan oil. Russia obviously depends on, I wouldn't say high oil prices, but at least oil prices above $60, $70. So with the US having control of Venezuelan oil, the largest known reserves, larger than Saudi, I think about 17% of global known reserves, and significant capacity to export more than they are right now. As I said earlier, they're producing about a fifth of what they were many years ago. So significant capacity there. So that gives the US a lot more leverage against China if they decide to take action on Taiwan. China imports all their oil, I think it's about 80%, and it gives them leverage over Russia in those negotiations. Now, it does take them time to up the production capacity of Venezuela, a lot of money and time, but that's one of the theories floating around. And I'd love to get your comments on this theory, but more importantly, why get rid of Maduro? Why capture Maduro if you seem to be okay with his regime remaining in power, which is what you said earlier in the interview, you predicted as well? Why not keep Maduro? What's the benefit? Is it just to get that military win, that political win? Because one mistake, one helicopter shot down could be, as you said, a massive political liability for Trump. So why take that risk that could have gone horribly wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think I answered or tried to answer that question, which is that they think that they can get to a more pliable figure and begin to split the
pliable how?
They think this is what Marco Rubio is saying through his proxies and may eventually say openly at some point. And it's what Donald Trump is saying. They think that Delcy Rodriguez can be someone they can work with more directly, and that Maduro was resisting what whatever deal they wanted, which was obviously going to be extremely onerous and was going to force Venezuela to give up its control over its own oil through the PDVSA managerial structure that was established under Chavez. So that's their thinking, and I see it from Marco Rubio's proxies in social media. Like, that's what they think is going to happen.
Do you think there is a long-term, potentially a long-term plan to have Maria Machado or Gonzalez, Edmundo Gonzalez, to take power in Venezuela? Because right now, at least in the short term, no indicator of any such plans. But Machado did say, today we are prepared to assert our mandate and seize power. So she seemed very confident when this took place that she would return, or she would gain power, not return to power. But you're saying that's completely off the tables, even long term.
I don't want to make some prediction and then get embarrassed down the road when someone digs up a clip of me saying it. So I don't want to even risk being wrong if I'm 99% sure. But here's what, like, I think is going on based on a fairly cursory reading of the situation, is that the U.S. the Trump Rubio administration is seeking to stabilize the situation under PSUV,
Maduro's political party,
possibly being delusional, and then set the stage for an election at some point when they think they can develop if they think they can develop an alternative power structure or institution to the one set up in the Bolivarian Republic, then fine. And they would groom a candidate either from within who had come out of PSUV, who was willing to do the US's bidding, or bring back Maria Corina Machado, since she does have her own constituency and power base, in the eastern parts of Caracas and in, some other more middle-class parts of the country. They would then do so, but Marco Rubio has said, we can't talk about elections now. Delcy Rodriguez is delaying elections herself by continuing to recognize, this is again a theory, continuing to recognize Nicolas Maduro, that will at least hold off elections for 4 months, because according to the Venezuelan constitution, in a succession of power, you have to hold, in an unexpected succession of power, you have to hold elections within 1 month, and that would destabilize Venezuela. And there's no clear candidate. Maria Corina chose to leave to take her Nobel Prize. She has no support within any powerful institution in Venezuela today under the Bolivarian Revolution. And that is the real reason why she cannot come back, and why Trump just probably ended her career with what he said yesterday.
Yeah. And I think it's important what you just said. You cannot, at least in the current system, you cannot have power in Venezuela without the support of the military. Based on the developments so far, you said one of the good things is that there's no instability, at least not yet in Venezuela. What are the risks of things changing? As we saw in Iran, people were talking about a regime change and people to go on the streets when Israel was striking Iran, but everyone rallied around the flag instead. But what happened months afterwards, especially with the ongoing economic pressure, as people took to the streets? Could we see the same in Venezuela? Could that maybe be the strategy to remove Maduro, start to impose economic pressure? And first, could that be a strategy? And second, what are the risks from what you're seeing right now that we could see instability, even risks of a worst case scenario, civil war in the country?
I don't see protests. That was something that was already tried during the Guarimbas, and they were very violent protests that killed scores of Venezuelan citizens, people on both sides, but people including Chavistas as well as innocent people who were just perceived as Chavistas. I mean, the opposition has been extremely violent, and that was kind of crushed through the issuance or invocation of the Constituent Assembly by Maduro. That's a past era. Civil war, yes, civil war is very possible. There are competing power factions in Venezuela. The Venezuelans within Chavismo are extremely upset about what happened. There is more national unity than in the past because of the violence and the sheer gangsterism of the U.S. Many Venezuelans who might not have supported Maduro are also nationalists, and they're offended by what's taking place. So there could be resistance building. And if a leader is imposed on Venezuelans who wants to just allow the U.S. business class to plunder the country, there could be resistance to that. I mean, it's all pretty obvious. And, another point about the military and why it's so unacceptable to the U.S. that a figure like Maduro or Diosdado Cabello have the support and backing of the military, and that they can't just dislodge them through a phony color revolution as they used to be able to do in the post-Soviet satellite states, is because the U.S. insists on being able to train and control all militaries across Latin America, and then to turn them on their people if the people protest IMF austerity packages. That's why they have the School of the Americas, which is now operating under a new title at Fort Benning in Georgia. And who was trained by the School of the Americas? One figure I can name was Manuel Noriega, who was paid something like $160,000 a month when he was a CIA asset throughout the 1970s. And he was also presiding over the trafficking of drugs to the United States, as well as weapons to U.S. proxies. And the trafficking of drugs was being done directly under the watch of the CIA in order to raise money for black operations against supposed socialist and nationalist forces like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And Noriega, as soon as he started to bristle at this level of U.S. control, or held a conference in Panama against continued U.S. militarization in Central America, well, they took him out under a anti-drug pretext, which was so ironic given that George H.W. Bush, who presided over that invasion, was the CIA director for all those years when Manuel Noriega was allowing drugs to proceed across Panamanian territory directly under the nose of the CIA. The Government Accountability Office of the United States government found that 2 years after Noriega was removed, the U.S. puppet government of Endara had actually increased the level of drug trafficking to the U.S., and Panama had become a haven for money laundering, in which the cartels were concealing all of their profits through shell corporations. That was really like what built Panama City. So this is all history that needs to be considered in light of what's taking place now. And it should inform our reading of the superseding indictment against Nicolas Maduro, who is being paraded around like some Roman trophy by the Trump administration and the DEA through New York. When he goes on trial, we should read this indictment closely, because it is basically a 25-page rant consisting of very sloppy claims, and it's another phony anti-drug pretext for a straightforward imperial plunder and robbery of Venezuela's resources, which it should control. So as this process continues to play out, if anyone wants to continue to pay attention, you're going to get a great education in how gangsterism works, and Venezuelans, I think, will close ranks in order to preserve what's left of their nation if Donald Trump really wants to go ahead with this plan to essentially own the country.
The comparisons you made to Manuel Noriega, the former leader of Panama, who was also initially a CIA asset, but also deposed by the U.S. military in 1990, I think it was, 89, 90. It was a 2-week operation, more bloody than the one we saw on January 3rd, obviously. A few U.S. casualties, I can't remember how many it was, and a lot more casualties on the Panama side. And it was also on January 3rd, a few decades ago. What comparisons would you make to that regime change we saw in Panama? And also, you've talked about the charges against Maduro. What type of sentencing do you think he'll receive? Where do you think he'll be held?
Well, he's being held in New York, and he's going to be tried in the Southern District of New York, so New York City. And this is the same court where former Honduran president and convicted narco trafficker Juan Orlando Hernandez was prosecuted and convicted. And he was granted clemency by Trump after a lobbying campaign by funded by Trump cronies who wanted to make money under a new Honduran government on the island of Roatan. I'm talking about Mark Andreessen, and I think Peter Thiel might have been another figure. And you saw, Roger Stone lobbying for Juan Orlando Hernandez's clemency. Juan Orlando Hernandez claimed, and Donald Trump repeated this claim in some form in his press conference yesterday, that he was the victim of lawfare, that he was persecuted. And Juan Orlando Hernandez specifically said that I was prosecuted on the basis of one drug dealer. The problem is his indictment, if you read it, was much more detailed than Maduro's. It contained photographic evidence, including cocaine bags that were engraved with the initials of his brother, Tony Hernandez, who's still in a federal prison. There was video of an informant within the Los Cachiros cartel showing Juan Orlando Hernandez on camera, confessing and boasting about drug trafficking and drug shipments to the United States. There's physical evidence of it. There were also many murders from friendly elements. He stacked the national police with cartel leaders. But let's go back to that allegation about one man. Well, Maduro's indictment is largely based on allegations by one man, Pollo Carvajal, who is a high-level security honcho under Chavez, who did not support Maduro, and then basically sang like a bird and said whatever he thought the U.S. authorities would have wanted when he fell into their hands and faced prosecution, thinking maybe if I make myself a valuable asset, I can avoid a long prison term. The beginning of the indictment starts out with a factual error. It reads, for over 25 years, leaders of Venezuela have abused their positions of public trust and corrupted once legitimate institutions to import tons of cocaine into the United States. I think they meant export, and that really hints at how sloppy the indictment is. Tons of cocaine. They don't cite how many tons, but later on in the indictment, the prosecutor at the time, Emile Beauvais, concedes unintentionally that Venezuela was actually only exporting less than 10% of cocaine that went to the United States. And then there's a ton of slop in the indictment about activities allegedly carried out by Maduro's family inside Venezuela or allegedly in Mexico outside the jurisdiction of the United States. So I think he has a pretty strong defense. There are protests outside the prison where he's being held, a large protest. And this is something you wouldn't see for someone who had been a widely loathed totalitarian dictator, to have supporters outside in another country. It's different from the Noriega situation as well, in that the U.S. did have boots on the ground in Panama. It destroyed an entire neighborhood in Panama City. There was much more carnage, but we're now learning that, at least 80 people were killed. And Trump has said that, he's not hostile to the idea of boots on the ground.
The last thing I want to get your thoughts on, and you mentioned it earlier in the interview, is the Chinese envoy that was in Caracas during the strikes, and they met Maduro hours beforehand. What does that say about China's involvement or lack thereof in this entire operation? And some are looking at the timing of this as potential, because China said, and they don't usually say this, they were shocked by the attack. They don't usually use words like that. Some type of message that Trump was sending to China to essentially to keep your hands out of our hemisphere.
It was a message to China, as was the attempted theft of the Bella One tanker, which actually got away, but was carrying Chinese oil and was not even sanctioned, as far as I know. This is not, so it's not just about Venezuela. It's a message to the entire Latin American left. It's a message to Russia. It's a message to China. It's a message to Iran. Trump is basically saying he can assassinate or abduct any leader he wants if he doesn't get what he wants in a deal. Trump, however, did say yesterday that Venezuela can export oil to China, which suggests there might have been some negotiation that took place either beforehand or immediately afterwards, because he did not want to infuriate China and make it so clear that he was seeking to impose a de facto embargo on China as well, which is importing so much oil from Venezuela. This is it opens the door for retaliation in different geographic poles of the world by Russia, which it looks like has faced drone attacks in Moscow and possible attempts at assassinating its president, Vladimir Putin, from Ukraine. That Russia could escalate against Vladimir Zelensky.
Do you believe those claims by Russia that his residence was targeted?
I would say I need to look more closely at that, but these are claims they're making, which set the stage for retaliation against Zelensky. And what could Ukraine say? Zelensky endorsed what Donald Trump did to Maduro, so he's putting a target on his own back. Taiwan, which is China, which is Chinese territory, I would say is more vulnerable now after what Donald Trump did. Greenland, Stephen Miller's wife just tweeted a map of Greenland with a US flag imposed over it. Donald Trump has said, well, we need Greenland not only because of minerals, but because of national security. There are Russian and Chinese ships trafficking throughout Greenland. And he's referring to control of the Arctic, which is a priority of the Pentagon. What can the Europeans do when they have just all bowed down and licked Donald Trump's boots? The Greek prime minister, who's a NATO tool, supported it. Keir Starmer refuses to condemn it. Emmanuel Macron, the billionaire banker in France, has bowed down before Trump and supported it. Won't even use the term international law. Kaja Kallas, who heads the foreign office of the EU, has refused to condemn it. So they're setting the stage for Trump taking Greenland, because there'll be nothing they can say about it now.
What do you think the world would do if Russia did the same thing? You said Zelensky put a target on his back. So if Russia goes ahead and kidnaps Zelensky the same way Maduro was kidnapped and shows them off, trials him like the US is doing so, having the photo ops that the US has done, how do you think the world would react to that?
Well, it would be similar to how the world reacted to Russia invading Ukraine after the U.S. attempted to NATOize Ukraine. And when we talk about the world, I think we should talk about the collective West, which has bowed before Trump, even as they exude contempt for him and his personality and his and the conservative constituency that he controls. The 50 or 55 or so countries comprising the collective West that vote together as a bloc behind the US and refuse to oppose in any meaningful way Israel's genocide in Gaza and the Holocaust of children that occurred there. They will react with righteous indignation to anything that Russia does and thunder condemnations about Putin. I saw a ridiculous headline in some legacy publication today that what Trump just did in Venezuela represents the Putinization of U.S. policy. No, this is classic U.S. gunboat diplomacy. It's how the U.S. has treated Latin America throughout its entire existence, going back to the U.S.-Mexico War. But now, at this point, after what took place in Venezuela and after the whole 2-year nightmare of witnessing the Gaza genocide, which was supported in every way possible by the collective West, their protests and their condemnations will ring hollow. And going back to your last question, we should ask if there is some larger negotiation taking place between the US, Russia, and China to formalize the great power competition in which great powers are given more latitude to operate with impunity within their poles of geographic power, within their strategic realms. And Marco Rubio made some comments that I thought were pretty stunning last year, but which make a little bit more sense now, when he actually said we are living in a multipolar world. It's not how I would envision a multipolar world taking place, but I can see it being a Rubio-centric interpretation of what one means.
Max, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mario.